So today I'd like to do an audio experiment. The other night we were at dinner listening to the news over Google Home, which gives us little snippets from different outlets. And one of the personalities was somebody named Alex Stone, who had this very old school delivery style, like, and this is Alex Stone with the news, and today we had, and it reminded me a lot of being a kid and watching some of those old newsreels that would start up before those old black and white movies. And for some reason, I was always really entranced by those things. And I don't know if it's the accent, although I don't think it's really an accent they have. It's just more the enunciation and delivery. But I thought it would be an interesting experiment to see if we can reverse engineer that with today's digital tools. At my age, it's all about that journey of learning, and what I like to do is reverse engineer something. So the process is to go back, think about what sort of microphones did they have, what were they recording into, what equipment was being used, what sort of processing did they have. So let's see if we can take those properties and replicate them with today's fantastic digital tools to give us a lo-fi rendition of modern audio that sounds like it was recorded back in the day. So that's what today's experiment's going to be. Okay, so this is the piece I am going to try to do.
The roar of politics starting in Chicago made the year's big story when the Republicans thundered, "We like Ike." Adlai Stevenson for us, answered the Democrats. And the battle went to the polls with results long to be remembered.
Okay, short and sweet. So let's get that clip out into Adobe Audition so I can give it a better listen. And let's take some recording takes and see what we can do with it. Okay, so I'm recording this one on my iPhone because I'm recording straight into Studio One and I can't capture that with OBS. So we'll stitch this together later. I'm redoing the audio, trying to do it a little bit more in his style, using that monotone modulation and articulation bit. So I'll do a few takes with this. The roar of politics, the roar. Let's go with that. The roar of politics, the roar of politics, the roar of politics starting in Chicago made the year's big story when the Republicans thundered, "We like Ike." Adlai Stevenson for us, answered the Democrats. And the battle went to the polls with results long to be remembered. That'll do. Okay. A lot of takes, but I think we got it. Well, that was fun. So let's do a little side-by-side listen and first see what the outcome sounded like, and then I'll take you through the process of what I did to get there. In your left ear, you'll hear the original newsreel track, and in the right ear, you'll hear the take that I did.
The roar of politics starting in Chicago made the year's big story when the Republicans thundered, "We like Ike." Adlai Stevenson for us, answered the Democrats. And the battle went to the polls with results long to be remembered.
Okay, not so bad. Not perfect, but pretty close. So let's dive in and take a look at how we did this. So we're looking inside of Studio One now, which is my preferred digital audio workstation. Truly, any one will work. This is just the one I've been working in for a while now. I've set up my workflow to follow what I think was what they were doing back in the 40s and 50s for the sample that I was using. So my first channel is just my input, my raw audio. I have a compressor, EQ, and a tube amp. This would then go on to tape, which would include some tape saturation and some EQ characteristics of tape transfer. And then I have another channel for the film transfer, which again uses a bit of processing to emulate what that would look like. So let's go through each one of these and see what we have. So first, let's just listen to the raw audio as it was recorded from this microphone. The roar of politics starting in Chicago made the year's big story. Aside from the vintage pronunciation, it still sounds pretty clean and modern production. So the first thing we add in is a compressor. And this is really just kind of squashing down some of the peaks, and it brings out a little bit of the spit in our articulation. The roar of politics starting in Chicago made the year's big. Then we add in EQ. And the EQ looks like this. We roll off the low and the high end Again, just kind of replicating that lo-fi kind of sound. And there's a peak around 200 hertz and another up a little over 550 or so to kind of give it a little bit of that boxy mid-range sound.
The roar of politics starting in Chicago made the...
The next thing we add is a bit of tube amplification with distortion.
The roar of politics starting in Chicago made...
That's getting pretty close. I tried a few different things, but what I settled on, ironically, was a emulation of a Marshall guitar amp with just a little bit of distortion on the amp to start breaking it up, and going through an emulated 1x12 cabinet. There are a lot of different tools that you can use to get this. I just played around with several different ones until I came up with something that sounded reasonably close for what I was doing here. So now that we look at the tape side, there's actually multiple effects that are combined into one panel here, which kind of gives you saturation control, a bump, bias, hiss, hum. It's actually comprised of multiple effects inside of this one component. It splits the audio into 3 chains. When you turn this on, you'll hear a little bit of hiss and hum come in the background. So we have a tone generator, generates our 60 hertz hum. We have a hiss generator generating some of that analog hiss. And then the third channel goes through EQ, and this emulates the response of a typical tape system. Then it goes through a tri-comp, which is a compressor which has actually a really nice saturation control on here to kind of give you that tape saturation sound. So going into this, now our audio sounds like this.
The roar of politics starting in Chicago made the year's big...
That's getting pretty close. The last thing we use is a Ozone Mastering preset, which actually has a few different modules in it. I have a vintage EQ, gives a little bit of boost up around the above 6K, below 10, where it rolls off. Again, this is kind of a common tactic that was used back in the day. As tape would tend to roll off, they would emphasize those highs prior to that just to kind of bring back some of that and fight some of the hiss. Vintage tape module, again, gives you kind of a saturation and drive sound that you get when you're transferring to analog equipment. Exciter adds some overtones in the mids and highs that would emulate, again, some of that distortion that you get. And then a maximizer just to level out the volume. So this is the final output from that.
The roar of politics starting in Chicago made the...
The last thing I added were 2 tracks with some vintage music and crowd noise, just to kind of fill in what they were doing in the original, and this is what it sounds like altogether.
The roar of politics starting in Chicago made the year's big story when the Republicans thundered, "We like Ike." Adlai Stevenson for us answered the Democrats, and the battle went to the polls with results long to be remembered.
So that's the process I came up with, and again, just kind of reverse engineering, logically thinking through what did they have in the 1940s and what can I do with my digital equipment to get that similar sound. This is an exercise I tend to do a lot whenever I'm presented with something. It's very easy to go out on the internet and find somebody who's replicated something. But from a learning exercise, I find it very valuable to go through and see what I can do to understand what they were doing back then, what the signal chain was, how these sounds and controls interacted with each other so that I can try to replicate it with the tools I have on hand. This is a very good exercise to do to help you understand sound and the dynamics of sound. It's just a good learning exercise in general. So I hope you enjoyed our little trip down history lane and our reverse engineering, and I'll see you again soon. Thank you.